My name is Adam Malka. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Oklahoma. As you know, I've written my first book on policing and race in antebellum and postbellum Baltimore. And my work focuses broadly upon questions of criminal justice, incarceration, policing, and in the era of slavery and emancipation. And that's, I don't know, do you have anything else about me?
No, I think that's great. So yeah, the book Men of Mobtown. So maybe we could start with how I was surprised to learn about the free Black population in Baltimore prior to the Civil War. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and then how policing started in that time period and how it kind of developed.
Sure. So Baltimore, Baltimore actually had the largest free Black population in the United States during the pre-Civil War era. It was, unlike today, Baltimore was actually the third biggest city in the then United States before the Civil War. And unlike many of the other big cities, it had a pretty substantial free Black population. Now, to be clear, that Black population was not a majority, anything like it would become in the post-Civil War era, as in many other cities. But it was the largest in numerical terms. It dwarfed the Black populations of New York or Philadelphia or even New Orleans and Washington, D.C. And then the reason for that large free Black population had to do with the existence of slavery in the state, that there were the upper South was where you see large numbers of manumissions during the first half of the 19th century. You see much bigger free Black populations in states like Virginia and Maryland, and Baltimore being the biggest city in that region drew a lot of recently freed people into its environs. It also was home to one of the bigger ports on the eastern seaboard, and the maritime trades was where many free men of color were able to find paid work. Which is not to say that that was the only place they did, but that is one of the bigger industries for Black labor in the pre-Civil War period. And your other question had to do with the rise of the police force. So, unlike many of the other Southern states and cities, Baltimore, being a large city that was deeply embedded in a transatlantic industrial economy, established a professional police force much in line with cities like Philadelphia and New York and Boston. So whereas you often see histories of professional policing focus on the North, and then in the South, you often have stories of slave patrols and things of that nature. You don't have like a very big urban population in the plantation South the way that you did in the industrializing North. Baltimore had both an industrial sector and it had a large Black population. As such, it ended up with a professional police force in the 1850s, much like its northern neighbors, but it also had a slave code, whereas those other cities didn't have that.
Now, one of the things that was most intriguing to me, and really just kind of tied white supremacy to government, the institution of politics, was this notion that you talk about in the book about how prior to the professionalization of the police, it was every white man's duty to, if you see something, do something kind of thing, and how that tied to the property of government participation. So maybe if you could kind of unpack that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, and this is where you see the history of the slave patrol, or that sort of history, kind of meet the history of the police force. They're not the same thing, and they occupied different parts of the continent in this period. But in a place like Baltimore, you see them coming together, and it sort of casts into sharper relief that their relationship that may sometimes be more hidden in other places. So in a slave society, it was incumbent upon all white men to play some role in the policing system of, whether it was in the countryside, in the deep South, of being members of slave patrols, or simply having the power and authority to stop any Black person that they saw walking along the road and ask for their pass, because that was something that they could and did do. White men, whether it was in cities like Baltimore or in the deep South countryside, had enormous power, at least to enact arrests and to detain people of color. They couldn't. Now, if you were an enslaved person, or if there was an enslaved person, there was a limit to the power that another white man would have over that person, because of the rules of property, right? Like, they couldn't, if they killed an enslaved person, then they owed the value of that person's life to the slave owner. But when it came to free people of color, they had a pretty enormous amount of power, which I also don't want to overstate, because I don't want to suggest that free people of color were slaves, because they also had rights, especially in a place like Baltimore with such a robust Black community. There were protections, something that many historians would hasten to tell you. It's just that when it came to criminal justice, that most white men, even those who were more nebulously white, according to the racial norms of the day, like the Irish, even they had pretty significant police power when it came to Black people. And I wanted to show that power persisted, and in some ways was institutionalized by the rise of the police force. Whereas many times when we narrate the birth of the police force, we kind of use a European theoretical model to explain, to suggest that the police force represented the institutionalization of legitimate force by the state, that the state monopolized legitimate force for the police force. They took it away from the citizenry, that it represents like an end of democracy. But when it came to race, I suggest that democratization of police power continued. And in some ways, it actually reinforced ordinary white male citizens' power over Black people, like that the police force was really more an extension of their power than a replacement of it.
Yeah, and you spend a lot of time talking about the night patrols specifically, because it seems like the day policing was dealing more with tracking down stolen goods, and the night watch was its own kind of creature, I guess, if you wanted to say it that way.
Right. So you're talking about the period. So in Baltimore, the police force was introduced in 1857, and then sort of reintroduced in 1860, because through partisan politics, different groups were unhappy with the police force because they were also organized mobs. But before 1857, you had a much more ad hoc system. This was carried over from the British system of a daytime constabulary and a night watch. And the night watch was insofar as either of those institutions looked like policemen of today, like the night watch was closer. There were beats, they patrolled. It wasn't quite so preventative as it was responsive to calls of crime, but the night watch at least existed in a crime control capacity, whereas the daytime constabulary was mostly unpaid people working on commission to recover stolen goods. I mean, that's not to say that they didn't make arrests and that they didn't play a role in the policing system, racial or otherwise, but it just suggests that you were more likely to see night watchmen play that role. And in Baltimore, in a city like Baltimore, and this is true for many cities in the United States before the 1840s and 50s, before the establishment of police forces, there were periods of time where there were no night watchmen or constables working. So, you know, it seemed maybe it was a good idea if you were going to like steal something or commit a homicide or do whatever it is you wanted to do. Like you would just wait until like 6 a.m. or 10 p.m. or whatever it was that those hours between people being on the job.
Well, and you kind of hinted at the mob of your Mobtown book, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how that was, because I mean, when I read it, I thought, oh, the organized like crime mob in that sense, but in this way, you mean like a big.
Well, Mobtown was actually a nickname of Baltimore, dating from the War of 1812, and that was a mob. That was, and it wasn't a racial mob in that case. It was a mob that it was a riot that erupted over the publication of some anti-war material by a Federalist publisher in the city, who was against the War of 1812 and was against the Madison administration. And Baltimore was a pretty pro-war city, and the Jeffersonian / Madisonian mob basically they committed a lynching of a number of like esteemed Federalist supporters of this newspaper, and including they actually killed a Revolutionary War hero. So the history of rioting and mobbing in Baltimore was not always a question. It was not simply a history of racial mobbing. Likewise, the biggest riot in the city's history was the 1835 bank riot, which also involved primarily white people, you know, trying to kill each other. So there was quite a bit of violent street activity, and it wasn't just those big blowups. Like by the 1850s, Baltimore, really every election day, which were more frequent than you would realize now, election days brought violence, it brought death. This was an era before the secret ballot. In fact, this is the era that sort of helped give us the secret ballot, because voting was so literally dangerous. So yeah, there's a long and rich history of urban rioting in this era, and really Baltimore was probably the most riotous of all the cities when you're thinking about places. I mean, you know, New York had its fair share as well in Philadelphia, and some of these riots were race riots, but they were not exclusively. This was also an era where Catholics and Protestants fought each other, where Democrats and Whigs fought each other, where rich and poor. I mean, there was just all kinds of stuff. Really, Jacksonian America.
Yeah, it was crazy.
It was a mess.
Yes. So, and some of that led to the professionalization of the police, correct?
It does. Yeah. I mean, historians in the past have disagreed over what it was that specifically prompted the introduction of police forces. And I don't really get into that particular debate. I'm more interested in what happens to like ordinary white men's racial authority when that happens. But yeah, I mean, certainly there is an argument that the urban rioting was one of the big catalysts for the introduction of police forces. And then to be clear, it's not as if the police forces ended urban rioting. There were dueling police forces in some of these cities that would have riots with each other. So, you know, including in Baltimore in the late 1850s.
Well, I think you brought up another point that, so we have these free blacks in the city, and we also have these empowered white men. And I guess what happens after the professionalization of the police, because one of the things that surprised me was when a black person was arrested or taken to the courthouse, there were different outcomes depending on if they were white or black, as well as if they were free or slave.
Right.
So maybe you could speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So I think what you're referring to is in Maryland, especially during the 1850s, they began to, I mean, this really began in the 1830s in the aftermath of Nat Turner's riot in Southampton, Virginia in 1831, but sort of picking up steam as the secession crisis grew more prominent in people's minds and in city politics and in national politics. And in the 1850s in particular, you have sort of a racial, a hardening racial climate, and what the state of Maryland starts to do is they start to condemn free people of color who have committed certain crimes to be resold into slavery. This was called, even if this was someone who had been born free, they called this reenslavement. And you do see a movement for reenslavement across the South as the 1850s progress. Only in Maryland and I want to say Mississippi does it get a two very different states with different demographics with different contexts, but you have the rise of these reenslavement movements, and only in those two places does it get like a real hearing. It does not succeed. The city of Baltimore, on the whole, comes out strongly against reenslavement en masse, meaning the reenslavement of all of the city of Black Marylanders, simply selling them into slavery and getting them out of the state altogether, or putting them into slavery, back into slavery. But through the criminal justice system, far less contentious and far less opposed was a lower level system of reenslavement, whereas especially property crimes and crimes that were associated with African Americans, not fairly, but simply by virtue of blossoming racial science, crimes like rape, but especially theft, was that African Americans who were convicted of these things were sold, instead of being sent to the penitentiary, they were sold into slavery. And there were some issues that, a lot of times the state would mandate that they be sold out of state, meaning into the deep South. Just get them out into the deep South, send them to Georgia, send them to Louisiana. But then a lot of southern states barred the purchase of slaves who had been convicted of crimes. And so, this was just one of the many bizarre things that occur in the American legal system during this era of fractured policy or fractured legal systems. Anyway, I'm kind of going off into nonsense right now, but yeah. So you one of the remarkable effects of this is that the Maryland penitentiary, the state penitentiary, becomes far more white demographically, and so by the time right before Emancipation in the mid 1860s, it was something like 75% white, because the only people of color still in the penitentiary had been there from a long time earlier, because almost none of them had been there for recent crimes because they were just being sold into slavery. So I think that's what you were asking about.
Yes, yeah, and also the fact that white criminals would go to the penitentiary, but African Americans would be sentenced to so many whippings or whatever. Right.
And sometimes they wouldn't even make it into the courtroom, right? Like police officers or ordinary citizens with police officers, they would just either let them back out, or they would whip them, or they would, and this, again, you didn't have to be formally sold into slavery. This is also the era of Solomon Northup, who, was portrayed, and that story was turned into an Academy Award-winning film. There was also reenslavement also happened on a more ad hoc basis through kidnappings. And so people who were arrested were very vulnerable. People of color who were arrested were very vulnerable to the types of things that happened to Solomon Northup.
Right. And then I think if we kind of talk now about the idea that Black freedom turns or becomes tied to criminalization and criminal behavior. And what I was most surprised about was that the abolitionists, argued for this in a way that was interesting as well.
Yeah. So I have a couple of things to say about that. First of all, my argument that the criminalization of blackness, which is something that's been written about by historians, especially in about the early 20th century, Khalil Muhammad's work on the condemnation of blackness. Like I wanted to suggest that this is happening well before not only the progressive era, but well before even emancipation. That you see the criminalization of blackness and the condemnation of blackness, as has become known in the scholarly literature, pre-Civil War. So that was something I wanted to focus on. I also should note that my argument tying in certain anti-slavery positions and people, let alone some abolitionists, to the rise of a kind of a racialized penal system, like is a more controversial claim within the field. So there are definitely adherents to a more kind of liberal progressive narrative of abolitionists that I depart from. So I should probably note that some of the scholars disagree over this. But yeah, my argument is that that adherence to classical liberalism, like the ideas of penal reform, including some abolitionists, are totally fine with the incarceration of Black people in much the way that their opponents had been, fine with not sending people of color into the penitentiary, right? Like, so like a lot of pro-slavery people were advocating for the reenslavement of African Americans, as I just was discussing. So it shouldn't be that surprising that people who are anti-slavery would be saying, no, what we need to do is create a more formally equal system in which we send Black criminals into the penitentiary where they can be reformed into good citizens, because that was the idea behind the penitentiary system, at least in the early to mid 19th century, at least discursively, ideologically. Whether or not it ever did any of that, that's a broader, bigger conversation. So yeah, I mean, there were definitely anti-slavery activists, there were definitely abolitionists, there were definitely Republicans who were completely comfortable with the changing demographics of the Maryland State Penitentiary in the aftermath of emancipation. And I should, just to be clear for those who haven't read the book, I mentioned how it was 75% white by the moment of emancipation in 1864. Maryland emancipated on its own in 64. By 1868, it was 75% Black.
Yeah, and that what I found interesting too was the fact that things that, and this kind of carries over into what we saw last year with the videos that kind of took over, where white women were, challenging Black people for doing everyday things. But there's this argument in the book about how Black freedom, and once emancipation happens, anything that looks like Black freedom is somehow criminalized. So gatherings and some of their housing and all this kind of stuff becomes justification for white intervention or arrest, I guess.
Right. So one of my arguments is that the process of emancipation, the goals of emancipation in the mainstream, and this includes things being fought for by African Americans, formerly enslaved and otherwise, are liberal. And again, I'm using a liberal in the classical sense, the Lockean sense, and that two of the biggest rights that were fought for by Black and white Black and white allies and opponents of slavery and opponents of really, proponents of emancipation, the things that they fought for, especially in the aftermath of emancipation, were the right for African Americans and former slaves to head their own households and the right to earn a living wage. And my argument is that these rights were often seen by many mainstream white folks who were either, maybe they were former Democrats, maybe they were former Whigs and were Republicans, but they viewed these things as criminal. So I look at, in that, I think you're referring to the final chapter of the book, I believe chapter 7, where a number of things that were simply Black people enacting their freedom were considered criminal, like and that is something I think that that if you look at the history of free people of color in the 1850s, it can tell us something about the reception that freed people in the 1860s and 1870s were, the ways that they were greeted by mainstream society. And free people of color, their freedom had been criminalized in the years prior, and so as the legal code is deracialized, as the criminal code is deracialized, and the state, at least formally, obviously in practice it doesn't always happen, but formally the state sort of removes those differential punishments that you were referring to earlier. Even as that happens, Black people, a wider range of their behavior is still understood to be criminal. And so one of the fundamental tenets of a historian or a social scientist, usually, who are writing about the history of crime and criminal justice, one of the things that I think many of us take for granted that may not be taken for granted by lay readers is, and so I don't want to this sounds a little preachy. I don't want it to sound that way at all. But one of the things that I take for granted is that crime is a social construct in that sense. So, it's not so simply a question of this person committed a crime, this other person committed a crime. But in fact, what we understand to be crime is historically situated, and it's shaped deeply by various power differentials.
Right, and it was interesting too how the kind of, it almost sounds like arguments used today, whereas I'm struck by the one domestic violence case where the police officer basically executes the wife and then shoots the husband who's holding her. And I mean that harkens to today's police violence, but some of the arguments as to fundamental Black behavior. The slaves needed someone they were inherently lazy, so they needed structure and they needed the strong oversight. And then you get the policing kind of tied into that. I guess, is that kind of what you were talking about with the power differentials?
Sorry. Yes. I don't know why I muted myself at the moment of speaking. Yeah, that is exactly what I meant, right? So instead of Black men are looked at as lazy and indolent and unwilling to work for wages. And so in the aftermath of emancipation, you see the passage, and this is true not just in Baltimore, but across North and South. You see the rise of really punitive and very broadly defined vagrancy laws, right? So you see one of the things that skyrockets is what we call peace crimes, or the prosecution of Black people for peace crimes, disturbing the peace, disorderly conduct, vagrancy, all of these things. You see people and that's often done in the framework of policing the labor market, right? That's how those offenses are understood by the powers that be, or the powers that were, which is you are enacting and enforcing a vagrancy law in order to uphold the tenets of a free market labor system. And so in a wage economy. And so the idea was that Black people were inherently lazy, or they were, and this is also the rise, this is also the rise of racial science and early eugenics, right? So these things are not happening isolated from each other. And so it shouldn't be surprising that that African Americans, and especially Black men, were looked at as incapable of functioning in a wage economy, considering what we know about the history of race in the era of slavery, and then of course also in the history of race in the era of emancipation. So yeah, and likewise, Black homes were viewed by the mainstream as inherently disorderly. Oftentimes they were equated with brothels. There's another historian wrote a terrific book about brothel prostitution in 19th century Baltimore, and this is true in Baltimore and other cities, in the post-emancipation period, the brothel prostitution became criminalized in ways that it hadn't been quite so criminalized in the pre-Civil War era. And the city authorities moved brothels, which had sort of functioned in the mainstream before this, they moved them primarily to the poorest areas of town, which were in disproportionately Black neighborhoods. And so you have, not only did you have the rise of, or not rise seems is the wrong word, not only do you have many white Baltimoreans and citizens seeing prostitution as racialized, but the brothels themselves are now being located by edict of the city in Black neighborhoods. And so these things all come together in various political leaders' consciousness, and and then it's enacted through the criminal justice system that Black people are then prosecuted at much higher rates.
Yes, and I think that there's a lot more we could probably talk about, but this is probably a good place to to leave it.
Hopefully that was clear.
It is. It's absolutely clear, and I think the one of the things that, I mean, we could have gotten into the whole household discussion, but I think that's probably too much for.
Okay. Yeah. No.
It's. I mean, it was really fascinating, the fact that, like, the home invasion and the vigilantism and the just.
Well, one thing that I will say in closing is that I think if I could do one thing differently in the book, it would be that I think I don't conclude that vigilantism ends with emancipation, but I probably should have made it more clear that the white vigilantes persist in the post-emancipation period, especially in the South, but really my suspicion is all over when it comes to policing Black people, that they persist pretty dramatically. And you would, and I can definitely say that you see a rise, a resurrection. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but you see them become much more prominent again when Jim Crow laws are reinstitutionalized, not reinstitutionalized, when Jim Crow laws are codified in the 1890s and early 1900s across the South, and especially in the urban South. You do see white citizens doing a lot of the stuff that I talked about from the 1840s and 1850s. You see them performing those same tasks in 1900 New Orleans, in 1910 Montgomery, Alabama, and Atlanta, places like that. So I think the other thing that we could have talked about is, what are the legacies of that vigilantism? Like, how does that speak to the questions of policing that we confront today, right? And so one of the last argument that I would make, and the thing that I'll leave you with, is that, one way to see, I said how a lot of our older histories suggest that the policeman replaced the vigilante, but I think that another way to see the history of policing and police brutality, especially as racialized police brutality, is to understand the policeman historically as himself a vigilante, and so that, like, mob justice and police brutality are actually like two sides of the same historical coin.